Translation, a weekly-ish exploration of one fellow's translation of the Christian scriptures, one chapter at a time. I'm Brandon Rhodes, and across the internet for me is the translator himself, Brandon Johnson. Hi, Brandon.
Hey, Brandon.
Ready to keep diving through some Romans? It's getting kind of thick in the weeds here as all the arguments get denser and denser.
Yeah, and there weren't this many footnote-worthy changes here, but just so many lots of tiny ones that it kind of accumulates this larger picture, and just reading this in the context of the changes that we've already gone over, that makes a big impact.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so the words that we are going to focus on here, we're going to give kind of a bigger overarching way that we understand this chapter and the broader flow that it's part of as well. But we are going to talk about deviation instead of sin. We're going to talk about generosity as a word to use instead of other places, other translations use the word grace. And I think the reason, we'll get to it a little later, I'll just spoil it a bit here and say, grace isn't a bad word, but because it's a religious technical term, it's worth kind of loosening things up. And then, as you'll see, I think our hunch is that there is a base layer of economic concern to the text, and another base layer of the nature of Torah. And when you hear the words generosity and deviation through those lenses, it does change them. So we'll get to that. But I wanted to make sure you listeners and viewers know up front that what we're going to talk about first is kind of a build up to those words in a lot of ways. So the argumentation that Paul has been making, I think this chapter 6 is part of a letter that is not about the question of what do we do about being sinners in the hands of an angry God and what happens after we die.
No.
He's asking a much more specific question about not the problem of evil, but the problem of election and particularity. In tension with the promise of Yahweh that the elect will be vindicated, life wins out, and that everybody gets folded into it. And there's a tension that their lived experience is holding with that, particularly those of them who are following Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, are wrestling with, sure seems like the Gentiles are in on this thing now. What do we do about this? So he's asking the question about ethnic supremacism in both directions, and trying to, through Jewish imagination and practice and text, make sense of why he is arguing against that kind of supremacism and finding the way through. It's all very centered around Jesus. But you were pointing out that we should really begin understanding Romans 6 in Romans 5.
Right. Yeah, it does not make sense without the context. So we can revisit a little bit what we talked about there and come back to it.
Yeah. Is it 5:18 through 21. Just those last four
Yeah.
verses.
Yep. Yep.
And there it is.
There it is.
For those, I'll say this for those of you, I usually give a blurb here that we are reading out of Brandon's translation of Romans 5 and 6, which is the Liberation and Inclusion translation of the New Testament. So you can find this. If you're watching, it's on the screen. If you're listening, there's a link to it in the episode notes. It's litbible.net/Romans-5. So go ahead and give it a read.
Yeah. Therefore, like how through one shortfall the result for all people was a verdict against them, similarly, it's also through one verdict of being just that the result for all people was recognition of justness, life. Just as through the one's refusal to listen, the many were set up to be people who deviate, similarly, also through the one's consent to listen, the many were set up to be people who are just. Yet, additionally, Torah came in so that the shortfall would be excessive, but where deviation was excessive, generosity overflowed even more, so that just as deviation reigned with death, similarly, generosity would also reign through justness, resulting in age-long life through Jesus Christ our Lord. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So how's that set up Romans 6 here?
Yeah, it takes it so that generosity is reigning now because Jesus took care of the problem, right? Like he
Yeah.
paid the debt. Um, because where it's talking about Torah came in so that the shortfall would be excessive, it's talking about restitutionary justice, where if you steal someone's sheep, you owe them 4 sheep. If you steal someone's cow, you owe them 5 cows. The math is a little different depending on what's being stolen.
You have to factor
And
in deprecation and amortization
right,
of
it's
deprecation. There's a whole different
yeah.
form for it.
The idea is not just replacing what was taken, but also making it right by the time lost. All the considerations, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
um, so it's not that justice in Torah is about punishing the person who did wrong. Having to pay 5 cows probably feels like a punishment, but that's not the point. Point is for the person who was wronged to receive goodness,
Mm-hmm.
right? And but that gets exponentially more and more difficult the more wronging has happened against people.
Yeah.
So if we're actually following the requirements of Torah, the consequences of shortfalls becomes really excessive really fast.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes impossible to actually fulfill.
Yeah.
Uh, so that's where the generosity overflowed even more, even though the debt was astronomical, it still got wiped out.
Mm-hmm.
It's still the debt forgiveness was still done. And American Congress would take on this biblical perspective regarding student loans.
Yes.
But
No kidding. Yeah. Yeah. And this is in contrast to a punitive or carceral or retributive notion of justice,
right.
where the the saying they'll get what's coming to them, for them, justice is the wrongdoers
Mm-hmm.
get some sort of punishment, get what's coming to them.
Right.
But restorative or restitutionary justice is the victims get what's coming to them, which is their damn sheep back.
Right. It's a crime victims relief effort. Reparations is
Yeah,
maybe a good way to put it.
yeah, yeah. That is the heart of how you address violations of the sacred fabric of the community. To
Hmm.
say nothing of other categories of deviation that have more to do with um, cultic propriety and purity and all those other things. But
Right.
the most
Yeah,
of the
'cause it goes
social
back to
functions are like not rule breaker focused. They are victim focused.
right. Yep. And then it's kind of going back to the Romans 1, which was the thesis in our review of it here for the whole book. It was not faithfulness that leads to faithfulness, that
Yeah.
the just would be alive through faithfulness. That's what it's talking about here. It's Christ's faithfulness leads to building a world where we can all be faithful for each other, which results in life going that age-long life is anytime I see that I immediately think Deuteronomy 30. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And the reason we're talking about this like Torah way of understanding justice is because you might be thinking, hang on, I'm used to reading Romans 5 and 6, these questions of sin and law as being a universal thing, right? The problem Paul is responding to is there is a like base note to reality of God's moral standards and law that we are violators of. Therefore, we sinned. Therefore, we are sinners. Therefore, the problem is, what do we do about how do we get in, given that we've broken these sort of like cosmic rules?
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not there is any shred of truth to any of that scheme, it is not remotely what the hell he's talking about. He is
Right.
talking. This is
This is
again
very specific.
it's very specific. If you want to do business with those other kind of questions, you need to do it through the lens of how Paul is answering and responding to this challenge here of the challenge of particularity of calling and election. That Jesus is um, before he is Lord of all people, he is King of the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And the challenge of being a deviator is of being out, deviating from Torah. Um, it is a specifically Jewish question. Yes, all have deviated. There is a wider sense that he employs periodically. The heart of what he's going to, like I would say the disposition hermeneutically that I think we both take is when we see deviation in language in the really anywhere in the Bible, um, but particularly in a place where it's asking these questions of ethnic particularity. Is this talking about a certain category of deviation of just deviating from Torah? It's a breach of contract more than
Right.
a
Right.
break of being doing bad shit.
Right. Right. Yeah. And that's why it being about Torah specifically is important. Torah is that covenant, that contract that's in place that if you're not following the terms of the contract, then there's this problem. But once you've died,
Mm-hmm.
you're released from the terms of the contract, which is exactly what it starts talking about in chapter 6 and 7.
Yeah.
So maybe I should even look at 7 where it makes it really clear, and then we can kind of come back.
Yeah, I think it's a great
Uh,
idea. So yeah, Romans 7:1.
All right. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
All
and
right. Can you see it on the screen here?
yes, sir.
Okay. So yeah, this first paragraph of Romans 7, where don't you know, family, since I am speaking to those who know Torah, that's what this is about, right? Not just like you were saying, like a cosmic standard that everyone's breaking somehow. It's specifically to those who know Torah, that the Torah is lowered over a person for as long as they live. For, and here's the analogy. A married woman has been bound by Torah to a man while he is alive, but if the man dies, her obligation to Torah regarding the man has been counteracted. She's released from the terms of the contract.
Mhm.
So then, if she were to come to be with a different man while he is alive, while the first man is alive, she would be called maritally unfaithful. But if that first man dies, she is liberated from the Torah obligation. She is not being maritally unfaithful, having come to be with another man. The death nullifies the contract.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, the Torah is lord over a person for as long as they live.
Hmm. So this next chapter, so we're going to go back to the first paragraph in chapter 6, which gets into all these things of like how he's bringing in all of these things about the death of Christ and our participation in it, and somehow it is solving the problem. Like his atonement theory, his what does the cross mean to
Mm-hmm.
this challenge, this problem of like Torah has at once bound us as the Jewish people, he is saying,
Mm-hmm.
um, to like he uses this strong language of enslavement. But
Right.
I would say broadly, it's um, we keep being knuckleheads and deviating, and there's kind of a like relentlessness to the cycle of how to restore from deviations. And then also broadly, the Torah is a contract for how to, it's a landlord contract for getting to live in Yahweh's place. Here's this
Sure.
land that we're gonna do some cool special things in together. Okay, fam. Um, if you break the terms of land of of renting from me, of leasing this land, I will kick you out. If you cook meth in my rental property, I will kick you out.
Right.
And
Not as a punishment. It's not going back to that
no,
retributive justice, right? It's
no,
that's more of a boundary setting. Like, I'm not going to let you keep making my place toxic.
right, right. Yeah. She's toxic is exactly as you said that. Farm equipment just went by shooting herbicide. Um,
Oh, great.
how do I turn off the HVAC? Um, so yeah, the divine is setting a boundary. It's an appropriate consequence for the terms of this deal.
Yeah. If you're going to do that, I'm not going to stop you, but you can't do it here.
Yeah, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that's one challenge of Torah. The paradox is that Torah also ultimately gives this promise of life,
Mm-hmm.
and that God is going to be have a long faithfulness that will ultimately end well for those he is in covenant with.
Right.
So the challenge of like what the hell do we do about all this? Because right now, they're occupied by imperial forces. They are like the promises don't seem to have landed,
Mm-hmm.
and Yahweh seems to have taken their sweet time in bringing about that vindication and
Right.
restoration and restitution. So that's part of the problem here. is that Paul is saying the promise has come, but we're still under Torah as Jews. So how do we get free from that contract to be a bit more spacious about things, without looking down on that, um, yeah, but without succumbing to anti-Semitism. And here's
Right.
his effort at it, is this next chapter.
Hmm.
And he says, well, the solution is death, not death, not therefore we
Not
kill all,
execution.
not execution,
Yeah. Not genocide.
not genocide, no.
Yeah.
But that is one way to get out of the contract.
It is, as we see down in verse 7 here. Since whoever has died has been recognized as just, as meeting the terms of the contract, separated from deviation, separated from breach of contract.
Yeah.
Um, so that's one way, but that's a pretty uh, final way to go about it. Um,
Hence the loophole of participating in Christ's death, which is basically what the whole
right.
paragraph is here's the loophole.
Yeah. Yeah. Or don't you know that whoever was submersed in connection with Christ Jesus was submersed in connection with his death?
Mhm.
Therefore, we were buried along with him through the submersion connected with death. So just as Christ was raised from among the dead through the praiseworthiness of the Father, similarly, we also should walk in connection with new life.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. If we have become united through representation of his death, we certainly will also continue to be united through the reawakening, the re-lifening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you want to be able to get beyond the impasse of like the burden of restitution is so great, the way through it is participation in the crucified Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
That is the particular meaning of the cross. That is one of the particular meanings of the crucifixion of Jesus.
Yeah. He doesn't do a lot to explain how this works. Like, how is it exactly that we're connected with Christ through baptism, through submersion? How exactly is it that Christ's death means that we have died and are no longer under the contract?
Yeah.
Uh, he doesn't explain that. He kind of assumes that you already know that and is taking that presupposed understanding and applying it to the situation.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Well, I would say if you want to read a text that gets into a bit more of that logic there, Michael Gorman's book, Inhabiting the Cruciform God, um,
mm,
Theosis, Kenosis, and Justification, and Paul's Narrative Soteriology of the Cross.
oh
One
wow,
hell of a
yeah.
title, right? What he says in that book is that cruciformity, bearing a kenotic, cruciform, downwardly mobile,
Yeah.
self-emptying for the sake of
Kenotic, based on
others.
the Greek word for self-emptying. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Um,
Yeah.
that path of discipleship, faithfulness, fidelity to Jesus, the way of Jesus, is a form of participating in the cross, like
Hmm.
die to letting ego die. Um, let the self that um grasps at hoarding, hostility, antagonism, power and domination and supremacism, and lying and covetousness, all these things. That self is what gets to die so that
Hmm.
the new self in Christ that has been hidden there the whole time, I would say, and the mystics would as well, um, is what lives. So the loophole
Hmm.
of participating in the crucifixion is done basically through ethical formate. It is a mystic. It can be a mystical, sacramental thing that is also very tangible of how you relate to one another.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, ethics and justification, sanctification and justification in the old language are not that different.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you for coming to my
Well,
book club.
let's that's okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about how we're using the words deviation and generosity here
Please
that
do. Yeah, great.
connects with those ideas of dying with Christ and being raised with Christ. Um, so deviation, that's what's traditionally sin. Um,
Hmm.
Sin has nothing to do with the Greek word there. It's related, its origin is actually from like the Latin word for guilt, um, which is not what the Greek word means. Um, the Greek word being an archery term for veering off course, missing the target. I just learned a few days ago or this week that it was used in Greek poetry to refer to something that happens that sets someone on a particular course, like kind of sets a new destiny for them. So it's like a crossroads or a fork in the road, or another idiom would be like a turning point or a pivotal moment. Um, it's that
Yeah.
turning from the course that you were on and heading in a new direction. Um, so that's the broad linguistic cultural view of it. And sometimes in scripture, it does get used more like that. Like it talks about being a Gentile as deviation. It talks about um, having a disease as deviation, having a medical condition.
Hmm.
So in those ways, it's not about how you're living, what decisions you're making, what behaviors you have. It has to do with just a life condition outside of your control that in some ways has set the trajectory for you, right? So it does get used in that way too. The majority of the times, though, it does have to do a bit more with the choices that we're making. But it's not about behaving badly. It's about behaving in a way that is veering off course of the path that Torah is tracing out.
Yeah.
Um, so some of these things have nothing to do with bad behavior. Torah talks about like wearing clothing with mixed fabrics. That's deviation. Uh, Having mold on the walls of the house, that's deviation. Like it's not, being on your period is deviation.
Having
Um,
leprosy.
Having leprosy. Uh, so all these things are deviation, but not because they're evil, not because they're wrong, not because they're bad, just because there's a it's a really stringent set of like you are going to represent what living well, being well as a community looks like, health in the
Yeah.
community looks like, um, as a tool to be a light to all people groups, to fulfill the promise of Abraham that all people groups would be praised as worthy.
Hmm.
So that's kind of the big picture context there. And so if you're looking at it in this chapter, and Romans in particular, other places as well, as that breach of contract, with Torah being the contract, that's what it's talking about. Living in a path that is changing the direction rather than the path that Torah is lining out very precisely.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And some of those things are harmful against other people, and some of them are just not quite. We talked about kind of a virtue signaling ways of signaling that I'm part of this special chosen community, such
Hmm.
as not wearing mixed fabrics in my clothing. Right.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's deviation, not a synonym for bad behavior, not a
Yeah,
synonym for
yeah,
guilt.
yeah. And you didn't like what I'm hearing in that is there's yeah, one, it's not a synonym for guilt. Two, there's the particular question of it within the context of Torah, and then there may be in some verses a way to ask that question, to use this word picture of deviation to
Mm-hmm.
describe human infidelity to their calling, them missing deviating from the path of human flourishing and being good earth creatures. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's the same word picture, just being used within a different
Right.
context.
Right.
And
Right.
you did not choose to translate it differently for those two categories, I think, with some good warrants. But it's even if you read a translation with the word sin in there instead, know that though there are still two things being said. Like
At least two. Yeah.
at least two. And it is a word picture. It is not um a theological technical term.
No.
Or
Yeah. It did.
it
It
wasn't
didn't
that
come from
first.
religious language. Yeah. It's not where it was. It became that. It got turned into that by theologians. Not. It was not being used that way by Jesus and by Paul.
And they did that in part, either actively or incidentally, to clarify who's in and who's out.
Which is
In
the
Romans
opposite of the
is
point
pretty,
being made.
yes, yes, it's
Yeah.
awkward. Like,
Hmm.
indeed, all have deviated.
Yeah.
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 So that's a language change that is not just about kind of shaking loose our imagination from kind of the craft of church talk. Um, there's many profoundly consequential shifts that come with that. Um, I see some big shifts in what you do with the word grace. It's just worth saying up front that like grace isn't a, we don't really have an axe to grind with the word grace. It just like has been
Yeah.
co-opted by some
Not with
people
the
in some
English
dumb
word
ways.
grace in general. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and the way I'll speak for myself and say that the way that there's a tradition around grace within the church that is developed that is
Hmm.
often quite
Particularly within the like
glorious. Yeah.
Reform Calvinist tradition is problematic.
Yeah. But a more spacious Arminian or Catholic or Orthodox sense of uh grace as the abundant, generous life lifefulness of God in the world. Shit, yeah. Give me that.
Hmm.
It has nothing to do with rule. It's not about like what's your line about what you heard about mercy and grace?
Oh yeah. My pastor growing up, he defined these terms as mercy is not getting what you deserve, and grace being getting what you don't deserve. And the implication there that you only deserve bad things and no good things.
That's such a bummer. Yeah. So it's taking this amazing concept of grace and we're gonna pull it out of that like deservingness
Has
paradigm.
nothing to do with deserving
Not what he's talking about.
anything.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. It's generosity, even grace. You talk about someone being gracious is like a way to kind of reconnect with what the word is actually getting at, right? Um, Gracious has been less tarnished in my theological experience than
Same.
grace has.
Yeah. So why
Um,
generosity? Why generosity? And
yeah,
what does it
well,
do?
linguistically, it's a related word to the Greek word for gift. Um, so that's an easy connection there for me. I give a gift out of my own generosity. It has, again, nothing to do with what the other person deserves. Uh, Not in spite of or because of, just it's not part of the conversation.
Yep.
And it gets used very much in pairing it with economic language, whether it's a very literal economic application or kind of a figurative, metaphorical application.
Yeah.
Either way, it's part of that collection of words and imagery. Um, so if we're looking back at the last chapter, like we
Mm-hmm.
did, where that the cost of repaying the debts that I've incurred by harming people becomes excessive, and then the generosity overflows even beyond the excessive debt that I owe. So that leads
Oh.
towards that age-long life. Um, that's what we're talking about here is the generosity of Christ that was so big that it was even beyond the debt that I owe
Mm-hmm.
or that we owe as a community. It's sort of about individuals, but not really about individuals. It's more about the community.
Right.
Um, that's what we're talking about, the sense of, and we use generosity figuratively in English too, like um, kind of the benefit of the doubt, kind of using it in that language. It's like
Right.
if I quote somebody and say, well, I mean, it could mean this really ugly thing, but I'm gonna give them the benefit of the doubt and say maybe they had this good intention behind it, and you might respond, "Oh, that's a generous interpretation."
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep.
So that's it's not a brand new idea to use generosity in this way.
Yep. No, it's not. And it shouldn't be surprising that if we're talking about if debt forgiveness and debt resolution are the metaphors uh for the some of the terms of human belonging and membership in a community, and it is a very concrete and tactical or practical um image for what makes life hard.
Hmm.
um we shouldn't be surprised that like if literal debt language is being used, generosity language should be used as well.
Hmm.
And it's not mere metaphor. There's nothing mere about metaphor
Hmm.
generally, but it's not only metaphor
Yeah,
language
no, it
for
plays out in very concrete ways.
yeah, yeah. And like what does it mean to imitate the grace of God or participate in the grace of God? That's a great question. What does it mean to participate in and respond to the generosity of God? Well, that's got a certain leading energy to it, doesn't it?
Hmm.
Especially if you have a little bit extra or a lot of bit extra, especially
Uh-huh.
if you have a lot of it.
Right.
And that frame, that's the frame for what um our belonging is beyond the terms of Torah. If you get down to verse 14, deviation will not have lordship over you since you are not under Torah, but under generosity instead.
Hmm.
Like generosity as a paradigm word, as the word to put over the doorposts for what kind of world we're stepping into, in contrast to the thing that did help us get along for a long time, Torah. It's also it put them at an impasse. I
Hmm.
love it. I mean, it's hard not to be a leftist at times here when you see uh economic lavishness and justice as just like fundamental terminology for what God is doing in the world.
Right. Yeah, it's mutual aid is a core principle of Christian spirituality and scriptures.
Oh, come on. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, deviation will not have lordship over you, since you are not under Torah, but are under generosity instead. Your belonging is not based on carefully doing every single requirement that's contained in the Torah, being under that contract, but along with Christ, you've died and been released from the contract, so you're under the terms of Christ's generosity instead.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important to say because so often when I engage with Paul's work, I see how I appreciate how the voices that observe, boy, this seems like a slippery slope to anti-Semitism. Because it's
Mm-hmm.
so easy to make the Torah the bad guy. It was
It's
an
not.
antagonistic
Yeah.
force to the kind of belonging that Paul was seeking to, in response to Christ, cultivate. But the Torah isn't the bad guy; it's a gift, and it
Maybe
has,
not even an antagonistic force. Like
yeah. No, thank you.
it's depending on how you're relating to it is
Hmm.
antagonistic. It in and of itself is still good and valuable, worth referring to, right?
Yeah,
But it's no longer it longer has lordship,
yeah. Over who belongs and how to belong.
right? Right.
Um, yeah, it's also not just about like weird things that you have to do to your body and deal with mold and what women or people who menstruate do when they are menstruating. It's it's not even primarily about any of that. There's all kinds of sacred stories in there. There's also stuff about, every 50 years resetting the entire economic order for the good of those who are left out, back and
Right.
behind. There
You
is
were
stuff
left
in
out
there.
of the Sabbath, the
Yeah.
rest, the Shabbat.
Yeah. The generosity of God. Even their way of ritualizing what they do about deviations is about having a barbecue together
Mhm.
with an aroma pleasing to Yahweh. Right? Like this is
Right, right.
it I would say it's not it's there is meaning in the animal sacrifice, and they do it in a way that makes sure that the priestly class is well fed and everybody else can be too. Like they're not throwing it away.
Hmm. Right.
Uh there's a lot, like I love reading Torah and learning from those for whom that is the book of their heart and their people. Um
Hmm.
it's hard to hold that with some of the keys that Paul seems to strike at times.
Yeah. Well, that's why we're exploring in depth to see what's in there.
Hmm. Shout out on a few other small translation changes, just shifting over from slaves to enslaved workers.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, in and Was it the listening, consenting to listen versus obedient?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that last episode. Um, if you missed that,
Yeah.
worth looking into that.
The framework of all this is not about authoritarianism, including when God is the authoritarian figure, it's still not the point.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, it's using language, using a certain frame to make sense of something, but it is not. It need not be heard ontologically as like a fundamental thing.
Right.
Yeah, I love that, listening towards justness or justice. Anything else we want to explore here?
Yeah, I mean, it's coming at the end of this chapter here, back to the sense of calling and chosenness,
Mm-hmm.
talking in verse 19 there about uncleanness,
Mm-hmm.
um, and Torahlessness. I think we've talked before, especially in Hebrews. Go back if you haven't listened to the episodes in Hebrews around chapters the second half of 6 through chapter 9 is where we get into it in a lot of detail.
Yeah.
That's one episode for those 3.5 chapters. Um, Talking about what does it actually mean by clean and unclean. And it's not about keeping rules or being good versus breaking rules and being bad, being contaminated. It's about, are you prepared? Are you anointed? Have you been initiated and inaugurated into living into your particular calling?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or are you not ready to actually do that because you're mistreating people essentially?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're mistreating people, then you're not living into the calling to love your neighbor. Um, that's the broadest way we can
Yeah.
put it. There are more particular callings too, but so that language is here. Um, and you've been liberated from deviation and enslaved to God. You have your fruit for designation for sacred purposes, and the end is age-long life. Uh, Designated for sacred purposes, being traditionally holy, and that's that sense of, again, you've been given a particular calling. Again, Hebrews defines that particular calling as making peace between everyone. That sense of unity. And yeah,
Yeah.
go back and
Scroll
listen to
back through
the
the
ones about
episodes.
Hebrews,
That
everyone.
one's a banger.
Um, yeah, that's what, chapter 12.
Yep.
But so
Yeah. To be,
yeah.
yeah, designated for sacred purposes is to be, yeah, those committed to the way of peace, reconciliation, and human flourishing. Holiness is
Mhm.
not only about not cursing or like sacred
Mhm.
purposes sounds like about cultic matters. And the like the words we use, the way language lives in us and in sacred gatherings, fine, good. What that language is actually about in the early Christian imagination is about a whole new social order
Mhm.
grounded
Where
in
everyone
Jesus.
is included. Yep.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Which makes me think of like the desires of the flesh language in this chapter. It talks slightly different. It's like the mortal body and listening to its desires. Um, every time we see Paul listing behaviors that are connected with desires of the flesh, tradition I grew up in just assumed that almost always meant sexual sin. Um, but it's pretty much always about behaviors that are involving hostility, aggression, um, trying to meet my needs, and using other people to meet my needs. So therefore, harming them in the process, being combative and divisive, like all these things that hinder peace, hinder well-being, make harm the way of life, violence the way of life.
Yes. Yes.
That is the bodily desires. It's like my needs being met, and I don't give a crap about anybody else. Um, that's the desires of the flesh. And instead, it's talking about giving age long life through generosity. It's talking about this mutual aid, building this
Yeah.
world. Faithfulness leads to faithfulness. We can all have our needs met. take care of each other.
Mm-hmm. Bingo. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think that's a great place to wrap up. Thank you, as always, for your company on this leg of the journey. We are excited to continue to work our way forward into Romans 7 next week and 8 after that, my favorite chapter in the New Testament. The easiest way to support Founding Translation is to leave us a rating or a review on whatever app or player or website you have been enjoying this on, especially YouTube and Apple Podcasts. Makes it easier for more people to find the show. You can find us on Facebook as Found in Translation. You can read The Liberation and Inclusion Translation online at www.litbible.net and follow its developments on Threads at lit.bible. That's lit.bible. You can follow Brandon Johnson on Threads as at Old Song New Dance, and read more of his work at oldsongnewdance.com. You can follow me on Threads as at BD Rhodes, BDRHODES. The music you're listening to is by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com. Founding Translation was produced by Perry FM on unceded Chinook and Kalapuya land. Goodbye, Brandon.
Brandon.
Bye, everybody.